But what said he, if I should sort with another kind of ministers, whose chief contrivances and consultations are what art the prince's treasures might be increased, where one proposes raising the value of species when the king's debts are large, and lowering it when his revenues were to come in, so that he might both pay much with a little, and in a little receive a great deal. Another proposes a pretence of a war, that money might be raised in order to carry it on, and that a peace be concluded as soon as that was done, and this with such appearances of religion as might work on the people, and make them impute it to the piety of their prince, and to his tenderness for the lives of his subjects. A third offers some old musty laws that have been antiquated by a long disuse, and which, as they have been forgotten by all the subjects, so they had also been broken by them, and proposes the levying of penalties of these laws, that it would bring in a vast treasure, so there might be a very good pretence for it, since it would look like the executing a law and the doing of justice. A fourth proposes the prohibiting of many things under severe penalties, especially such as were against the interest of the people, and then the dispensing of these prohibitions upon great compositions to those who might find their advantage in breaking them. This would serve two ends, both of them acceptable to many. For as those whose avarice led them to transgress, they would be severely fined. So the selling of licenses would look as if a prince were tender of his people, and would not easily, or at low rates, dispense with anything that might be against the public good. Another proposes that judges must be made sure, that they may declare always in favour of the prerogative, that they may be often sent to for court, that the king may hear them argue those points in which he is concerned, since, how unjust soever any of his pretensions may be, yet still one or another of them, either out of contradiction to others, or the pride of singularity, or to make their court, would find out some pretence or other to give the king a fair colour to carry the point. For if the judges but differ in opinion, the clearest thing in the world is made by that means disputable, and truth being once brought into question, the king may then take advantage to expound the law for his own profit, while the judges that stand out will be brought over, either through fear or modesty, and they being thus gained, all of them may be sent to the bench to give sentence boldly as the king would have it. For fair pretence will never be wanting when sentence is to be given in the prince's favour. It will either be said that equity lies of his side, or some words in the law will be found sounding that way, or some forced sense will be put on them, and, when all other things fail, the king's undoubted prerogative will be pretended, as that which is above all law, and to which a religious judge ought to have a special regard. Thus all consent to the maxim of Crassus, that a prince cannot have treasure enough, since he must maintain his armies out of it, that a king, even though he would, can do nothing unjustly, that all property is in him, not excepting the very persons of his subjects, and that no man has any property but that which the king, out of his goodness, thinks fit to leave to him. And they think it is the prince's interest that there be as little of this left as may be, as if it were his advantage that his people should have neither riches nor liberty, since these things make them less easy and willing subjects to a cruel and unjust government. Whereas necessity and poverty blunts them, makes them patient, beats them down and breaks that height of spirit that might otherwise dispose them to rebel. Now, what if, after all these propositions were made, I should rise up and assert that such counsels were both unbecoming a king and mischievous to him, and that not only his honour, but his safety, consisted more in his people's wealth than in his own? If I should show that they should choose a king for their own sake, and not for his, that, by his care and endeavours, they may be both easy and safe, and that therefore a prince ought to take more care of his people's happiness than of his own, as a shepherd is to take more care of his flock than himself. It is also certain that they are much mistaken that think the poverty of a nation is a means of public safety. Who quarrel more than beggars? Who does more earnestly long for a change than he that is uneasy in his present circumstances? And who run to create confusions with so desperate a boldness as those who, having nothing to lose, hope to gain by them? If a king should fall under such contempt or envy that he could not keep his subjects in their duty but by oppression and ill usage, and by rendering them poor and miserable, it was certainly better for him to quit his kingdom than to retain it by such methods as make him, while he keeps the name of authority, lose the majesty due to it. Nor is it so becoming the dignity of a king to reign over beggars as over rich and happy subjects. And therefore Fabricius, a man of noble and exalted temper, said he would rather govern rich men than be rich himself. For since for one man to abound in wealth and pleasure, when all around him are mourning and groaning, is to be a jailer and not a king. He is an unskilful physician that cannot cure one disease without casting his patient into another. So he that can find no other way for correcting the errors of his people, but by taking from them the conveniences of life, shows that he knows not what it is to govern a free nation. He himself ought rather to shake off his sloth, or to lay down his pride, for the contempt or hatred that his people have for him takes its rise from the vices in himself. Let him live upon what belongs to him, without wronging others, and accommodate his expense to his revenue. Let him punish crimes, and, by his wise conduct, let him endeavour to prevent them, rather than be severe when he has suffered them to be too common. Let him not rashly revive laws that are abrogate by disuse, especially if they have been long forgotten and never wanted, and let him never take any penalty for the breach of them to which a judge would not give away to a private man, but would look on him as a crafty and unjust person for pretending to it. To these things I would add the law among the Marcians, a people that lived not far from Utopia, by which their king, on the day on which he began to reign, is tied by an oath, confirmed by solemn sacrifices, never to have at once above 1,000 pounds of gold in his treasures, or so much silver as to equal it in value. This law, they tell us, was made by an excellent king, who had more regard to the riches of his country than to his own wealth, and therefore provided against the heaping up of much treasure, as might impoverish the people. He thought that moderate sum might be sufficient for any accident, if either the king had occasion for it against the rebels, or the kingdom against the invasion of an enemy. But that it was not enough to encourage a prince to invade other men's rights, a circumstance that was the chief cause of his making the law. He also thought that it was a good provision for that free circulation of money so necessary for the course of commerce and exchange. And when a king must distribute all those extraordinary accessions that increase treasure beyond the due pitch, it makes him less disposed to oppress his subjects. Such a king as this will be the terror of ill men, and will be beloved by all the good. If, I say, I should talk of these things or of such things to men that had their bias another way, how deaf they would be to all I say. No doubt very deaf, answered I, and no wonder, for one is never to offer propositions or advice that we are certain will not be entertained. Discourses so much out of the road could not avail anything, nor have any effect on men whose minds were prepossessed by different sentiments. This philosophical way of speculation is not unpleasant among friends in a free conversation, but there is no room for it in the courts of princes, where great affairs are carried on by authority. "That is what I was saying," replied he, "that there is no room for philosophy in the courts of princes." "Yes, there is," said I, "but not for this speculative philosophy that makes everything to be alike fitting at all times. But there is another philosophy that is more pliable, that knows its proper scene, accommodates itself to it, and teaches a man with propriety and decency to act that part which has fallen to his share. If, when one of Plautus's comedies are upon the stage, and a company of servants are acting their part, you should come out in the garb of a philosopher, and repeat, out of Octavia, a discourse of Seneca's to Nero, would it not be better for you to say nothing, than by mixing things of such different natures to make an impertinent tragicomedy? For if you spoil and corrupt the play that is in hand when you mix it with things of an opposite nature, even though they are much better, therefore go through with the play that is acting as best you can, and do not confound it because another that is pleasanter comes into your thoughts. It is even so in a commonwealth, and in the councils of princes. If ill opinions cannot be quite rooted out, and you cannot cure some received vice according to your wishes, you must not therefore abandon the commonwealth, for the same reasons as you should not forsake the ship in a storm, because you cannot command the winds. You are not obliged to assault people with discourses that are out of their road. When you see that their received notions must prevent your making an impression upon them, you ought rather to cast about and to manage things with all the dexterity of your power, so that, if you are not able to make them go well, they may be as little ill as possible, for except all men were good, everything cannot be right, and that is a blessing that I do not at present hope to see. According to your argument, answered he, all that I could be able to do would be to prevent myself from being mad, while I endeavoured to cure the madness of others. For if I speak with, I must repeat what I have said to you, and as for lying, whether a philosopher can do it or not, I cannot tell. I am sure I cannot do it. But though these discourses may be uneasy and ungrateful to them, I do not see why they should seem foolish or extravagant. Indeed, if I should either propose such a thing as Plato has contrived upon his commonwealth, or as the Utopians practice in theirs, though they might seem better, as certainly they are, yet they are so different from our establishment, which is founded on property, there being no such thing among them, that I could not expect that it would have any effect upon them. But such discourses as mine, which only call past evils to mind and give warning of what may follow, leave nothing in them that is so absurd that they may not use it at any time, for they can only be unpleasant to those who are resolved to run headlong the contrary way. And if we must let alone everything that is absurd or extravagant, which, by reason of the wicked lives of many, may seem uncouth, we must, even among Christians, give over pressing the greatest part of those things that Christ has taught us, though he had commanded us not to conceal them, but to proclaim them on the housetops that he taught in secret. The greatest part of his precepts are more opposite to the lives of the men of this age than any part of my discourse has been. But the preachers seem to have learned that craft to which you advise me, for they, observing that the world would not willingly suit their lives to the rules that Christ has given, have fitted his doctrine, as if it had been a leaden rule to their lives, that so, some way or other, they might agree with one another. But I see no other effect of this compliance, except it be that men become more secure in their wickedness by it, and that this is all the success I can have in court. For I must always differ from the rest, and then I shall signify nothing, or, if I agree with them, I shall then not only help forward their madness. I do not comprehend what you mean by casting about, or by bending and handling things so dexterously that if they go not well, they may go as little ill as may be. For in courts they will not bear with a man's holding his peace, or conniving at what others do, A man must barefacedly approve of the worst counsels, and consent to the blackest designs, so that he would pass for a spy, or possibly for a traitor, that did not but coldly approve of such wicked practices. And therefore, when a man is engaged in such a society, he will be so far from being able to mend matters by his casting about, as you call it, that he will find no occasion of doing any good. The ill company will sooner corrupt him than be better for him. Or if, notwithstanding all their ill company, he still remains steady and innocent, yet their follies and knavery will be imputed to him, and by mixing counsels with them, he must bear his share of all the blame that belongs wholly to the others. It was no ill simile by which Plato set forth the unreasonableness of a philosopher's meddling with government. If a man, says he, were to see a great company run out every day into the rain, and take delight in being wet, if he knew that it would be to no purpose for him to go and persuade them to return to their homes in order to avoid the storm, and that all that could be expected by his going to speak to them would be that he himself should be wet as they, it would be best for him to keep within doors, and since he had not influence enough to correct other people's folly, to take care to preserve himself. Though to speak plainly my real sentiments, I must freely own that as long as there is any property, and while money is the standard of all other things, I cannot think that a nation can be governed either justly or happily. Not justly, because the best things will fall to the share of the worst men, nor happily, because all things will be divided among a few, and even these are not in all respects happy, the rest being left to be absolutely miserable. Therefore, when I reflect on the wise and good condition of the Utopians, among whom all things are so well governed, and yet with so few laws, where virtue hath its due reward, and yet there is such an equality that every man lives in plenty, where I compare them with so many other nations that are still making new laws, and yet can never bring their constitution to a right regulation, where, notwithstanding, everyone still has property, yet all the laws that they can invent have not the power either to obtain or to preserve it, or even to enable men certainly to distinguish what is their own from what is another's, of which there are many lawsuits that every day break out, and are eternally depending. To give too plain a demonstration when I say, I balance all these things in my thoughts, I grow more favourable to Plato, and do not wonder that he resolved not to make any laws for such as would not submit to a community of all things. For so wise a man could not but foresee that the setting all upon a level was the only way to make a nation happy, which cannot be obtained so long as there is property. For when every man draws to himself all that he can compass, by one title or another, it must needs follow that however plentiful a nation may be, yet a few dividing the wealth of it among themselves, the rest must fall into indigence. So that there will be two sorts of people among them, who deserve that their fortunes should be interchanged. The former useless, but wicked and ravenous, and the latter, who by their constant industry serve the public more than themselves, sincere and modest men. From whence I am persuaded that till property is taken away, there can be no equitable or just distribution of things, nor can the world be happily governed, for as long as that is maintained, the greatest and the far best part of mankind will still be oppressed with a lot of cares and anxieties. I confess, without taking it quite away, those pressures that lie in a great part of mankind may be made lighter, that they can never be quite removed, for if laws were made to determine how great to an extent in soil, and how much money every man must stop, to limit the prince, that he might not grow too great, and to restrain the people, that they might not become too insolent, and none might fatuously aspire to public employments, which ought neither to be sold, nor made burdensome by great expense, since otherwise those that serve in them would be tempted to reimburse themselves by cheats and violence, and will become necessary to find out rich men for undergoing those employments, which ought rather to be trusted to the wise. These laws, I say, might have such an effect as a good diet and care might have on a sick man whose recovery is desperate. They might allay and mitigate the disease, but it could never be quite healed, nor the body politic be brought again to a good habit as long as property remains, and it will fall out, as in the complication of diseases, that by applying a remedy to one sore, you will provoke another, and that which removes one ill symptom produces others, while the strengthening of one part of the body weakens the rest. On the contrary, answered I, it seems to me that men cannot live conveniently, where all things are common. How can there be any plenty, where every man will excuse himself from labour? For as the hope of gain doth not excite him, so the confidence that he has in other men's industry may make him slothful. If people could be pinched with want, and yet cannot dispose of anything as their own, what can follow upon this but perpetual sedition and bloodshed, especially when the reverence and authority due to the magistrates falls to the ground? For I cannot imagine how that it can be kept up among those who are in all things equal to one another. I do not wonder, said he, that it appears to you, since you have no notion, or at least no right one, of such a constitution. But if you had been to Utopia with me, and had seen their laws and rules, as I did, for the space of 5 years, in which I lived among them, and during which time I was so delighted with them, that indeed I should never have left them, if it had not been to make the discovery of that new world known to the Europeans. You would then confess that you had never seen a people so well constituted as they. You will not easily persuade me, said Peter, that any nation in that new world is better governed than those among us. For as our understandings are not worse than theirs, so our government, if I mistake not, being more ancient, a long practice has helped us to find out many conveniences of life, and some happy chances have discovered other things to us which no man's understanding could ever have gained. As for the antiquity of either of the government or ours, said he, you cannot pass a true judgment of it unless you had read their histories. For, if they are to be believed, they had towns among them before these parts were so much as inhabited, and before those discoveries that had been either hit upon by chance or made by ingenious men, these might have happened there as well as here. I do not deny, but we are more ingenious than they are, but they exceed us in much industry and application. They knew little concerning us before our arrival among them. They call us by a general name of the nations that lie beyond the equinoctial line, that their chronicle mentions a shipwreck that was made on their coast 1200 years ago, and that some Romans and Egyptians that were in the ship getting safe ashore spent the rest of their days amongst them. And such was their ingenuity that from this single opportunity they drew the advantage of learning from those unlooked-for guests, and acquired all the useful arts that were then among the Romans, and which were known to those shipwrecked men. And by the hints that they gave them, they themselves found out even some of those arts which they could not fully explain. So happily did they improve that accident of having some of our people cast upon their shore. But if such an accident has at any time brought any from thence into Europe, we have been so far from improving it, that we would not so much as remember it, as in after times perhaps it will be forgot by our people that I was ever there. For though they, from one such accident, made themselves masters of all the good inventions that were among us, yet I believe it would be a long time before we could learn to put into practice any of the good institutions that are among them. And this is the true cause of their being better governed and living happier than we, though we come not short of them in the point of understanding or outward advantage. Upon this I said to him, I earnestly beg you would describe that island very particularly to us, not to be too short, but to set out in order all things relating to their soils, their rivers, their towns, their people, their manner, constitution, law, and in a word, all that you would imagine we desire to know. You may well imagine that we desire to know everything concerning them, of which we are hitherto ignorant. I will do it very willingly, said he, for I have digested the whole matter carefully, but it will take some time. Let us go then, said I, first and dine, and then we shall have leisure enough. He consented. We went in and dined, and after dinner came back and sat down in the same place. I ordered my servant to take care that none might come and interrupt us, and both Peter and I desired Raphael to be as good as his word. When he saw that we were very intent upon him, he paused a little to recollect himself, and began in this manner.